Okay, so you can also post questions to our Facebook page. You can send a tweet to @CleaveTool, CLEVTOOL, or you can, I guess the other one is for YouTube later. You can post in the YouTube comments box if you think of something later, think of a question. We'll keep monitoring that and answer follow-up questions that way. So I think that's all the housekeeping stuff that we have to do. If you can, I guess, Bill, you can hear me okay, right? I see you muted yourself again, but if somebody can just type in the chat box if they can hear me okay, I'd appreciate that. Great. Okay, so we're going to start off tonight with the C-frame. And I'm going to do that because I get a lot of questions. Actually, that's not right. I ask a lot of questions. If people call, and I brought a set of Dimple dies that's looks like a number 8 screw. Yeah. So these are big dies, but with the 3/32 dies, the dies you use a lot, and they get hammered on a lot with wing skins and stuff. What happens sometimes is the tip, the pilot of the male die will break off. And so the first question I ask is, how were you using it? And if you were using it in a rivet set like this, and a bucking bar with a dimple in it. Let's use that as an example. It's really easy to get cockeyed and break the tip off of it because the tips are fairly small in the 3/32. More often than not, though, they break in the C-frame. And so I wanted to kind of go over how to line the C-frame up. Because the first questions I ask are, if you're using it in the C-frame, are you sure the C-frame's lined up correctly? And what can happen is, I guess it's going to take the RAM out here, but I'm going to pull the dies out and kind of explain it. What happens here is the dies go together, and the only purpose of the C-frame is to keep the top post and the bottom post collinear, so to speak, in line with each other in both this way, and angularly. And so we want to check that. And what happens if it's not lined up and these don't come together perfectly is they'll come together and they'll force the ram, or they'll force the bottom post. And this is in any C-frame; it doesn't have to be ours. It'll force it straight, and then force it to engage the male and female. And then when you hit it with the hammer, that sudden force will straighten everything out, and it causes a shear on the die, and that's what shears off that small pilot on the die. So what I have people do is I have them take the ram out of their C-frame, which is necked down to, it's about 400 thousandths or so down here, and flip it upside down so that the 1/2 inch end sits on top of the 1/2 inch bottom post. And when you do that, it's real easy to run your fingers up and down here very lightly with no first you want to drop the ram so that you're sure you haven't induced some kind of a side load on there by touching it or pushing on it. So you just want to drop it in just the way that you would if you hit it. So then you very lightly brush your fingers up and down here, and you can quite easily feel if the ram and bottom set holder are not in line with each other. You'll feel it on front to back. Then you move your hands 90 degrees and try it again to make sure that that ram is exactly in line with this bottom piece. And then the next thing I do is I get my eyeball down here so that I can see right at the crack, right where those two meet. And I want to make sure that there's not a wedge shape light coming through there to know if angularly it's incorrect. So this one's all lined up correctly. If it were not, what I would do is loosen these two bolts, or what are they called? Cap screws. And there's lock washers on there, so I loosen it until I can just see the lock washer start to decompress, but it's not loose yet. I can't move it. Just, I don't know what it is, a 1/2 turn or so probably. And then I get back up here and I feel the ram again, and I decide which way it needs to go. I didn't bring a hammer in here, but you could use a mallet, rubber hammer, a nylon-faced hammer, and just tap this in whatever direction it needs to go to line that up. If it's not angularly correct, which is very, very, very uncommon, you could put some foil underneath one side or the other to shim it up to get it exactly the way you need it. Or if it's severely out of alignment, if you dropped it, you could do the same thing back here. I believe there's about 50 or 60 thousandths, about a 1/16 of an inch of adjustment all the way around in this front plate, and then you have it again back here. So you get it as good as you can on the front, and if it's still not good, then you can loosen this back up and do it. And this back here is if you had a problem angularly, that you needed to twist the whole thing, then you would want to start adding some foil or whatever it took, paper back here to adjust it. So that's the first thing I ask people about the C-frame is when they're breaking dies, it's probably the C-frame, and so that's what we're wanting to check. Okay, so again, just throw some questions out there if you have any questions about that, and I'll just move on to the next thing, which is dimple dies, which I left on the table there, so that's good. Okay, so the thing I want to talk about dimple dies is sometimes people say that they get aluminum buildup on the outside edge, and that's pretty normal for the spring back dies, because this place where my fingernail's touching here, right there is where it contacts the material first, and then as you apply the pressure, it works its way down here. So you'll get a little bit of aluminum sloughing off on the outside of this. And I mean, that's fine. Functionally, they work perfect, but a lot of people like to polish that off. So what we use when we polish dies in our shop is we put them in a speed lathe, which turns them quickly, and then we have a little rubber block that we used wet and dry sandpaper. 320 grit and 600 grit are the two grits that we use. At home, I would recommend that you do this with a drill. Put it in your drill press or your air drill, and probably take 2 people, but you might be able to do it with 1. Instead of a rubber block, if you don't have that, you could use like a dedicated pencil eraser, a large lead eraser type thing. And so you spin it, and then you just run the sandpaper along the surface. Now, the 320 and 600 grit sandpaper is not going to do enough to cause geometry changes in the die. So it's not gonna change anything. It's just going to polish it. In fact, when we heat treat our dies, well, you can see on the back side they're kind of a purplish brown color, and that you have to, I guess I wouldn't say work at it, but it takes some rubbing just to get that off of it. So you're not changing the geometry at all. Just start at the tip and just work your way down across all the surfaces, and you can even do the outside to keep it shiny on the outside if that's getting dull. Same thing with the female. Start with the more aggressive grit and then go down to the 600 grit. These are polished with 600. I can find the camera. Polished with 600 now, so you obviously don't need to go any finer than that. Bear with me a second. I'm going to mute some audio here. If I can figure out how. Oops, I think I'm going the wrong direction. Bill, are you muted or unmuted?
I'm unmuted now.
Okay, thank you.
I think I have you covered on the mute there, Mike.
You do?
Yep.
Oh, I didn't know you could control it. Cool. All right, so back to what I was talking about. So that's how you polish the dies when they start getting scuffed up. 320 grit and 600 grit sandpaper. Okay, next on my list was flat sets. You use a little more aggressive sandpaper for flat sets. What happens with flat sets? Where is my flat set? Okay. So what happens with flat sets is this is a very shiny one, if it will ever focus on it. We're about to give up. There we go. Okay, so that's fairly shiny there. You can see just a little bit of scratch on the surface. Now what happens with flat sets is you're setting rivets with them, right? You're putting 3,000 pounds of force in the form of a rivet right on the end of this. And it wants to do anything it can to squirt sideways out of there. So if you're getting a lot of rivets that slide over sideways, first of all, you may be using too long of a rivet. You want to try and avoid using rivets that are longer than 1.5 times diameter sticking out. And the second thing is if the flat set that you use on the shop side, if it is too shiny, it will just slip. The rivet will just slip on it. So what you do is we always use our sidewalk, but that's inconvenient for showing this. So I brought a piece of a concrete block in here. So we just, let me switch views here. You just drag it one direction a couple times. And I haven't found anything that works better than the sidewalk. And then turn it 90 degrees. So I rotated it 90 degrees, and then drag it again a few more times. And that creates a crosshatch pattern. And I'll try and get this to focus this time. That creates that crosshatch pattern on there. And that allows just a little bit more adhesion for the rivet to not slide while you're squeezing. And as you squeeze more and more rivets, it gets shinier and shinier. So you have to go back to the block to do that. So that's not uncommon. Some people will put a piece of masking tape on there as well, and that again just provides that friction so that it doesn't slide. So again, let me know if you have questions there. And next on the list is air tool oil. And this is, I think, pretty well understood. We don't get many questions about this, but I just thought that it was a good thing to cover. So when you're oiling your tools, some people do call and ask where you put the oil. You just put it in the air tool inlet, and it's just a couple drops, maybe 3 drops. And you'll actually find that the inlet fills up because it doesn't have any place to go. It doesn't have a vent to let it through there. Sorry, I'm struggling with the hose here. So you put a couple drops in the air inlet, and I do this when I'm done using the tool. All the instructions say oil it before you use it. To me, before you use it means after I'm done with it and before I use it the next time. And the reason for that is I put a couple drops in here, and I plug the hose in, and then with air on it, I pull the trigger a couple times and let it displace the oil through the tool, getting rid of any moisture, hopefully, and coating all the parts with oil. So rivet guns you want to do that with. Drills you want to do the same thing with. A couple drops in here. I remember this one says oil daily on it. Yeah, oh, it's wrong coupler. You obviously don't need to oil it daily if you're using it once a week. So just put oil in it before you're done with it. Hit the trigger a few times to throw it through, and that is good. Now the only time that you don't want to use air tool oil in your tools are on the pneumatic squeezer, and that is because the pneumatic squeezer has a leather piston inside of it that's like 2.5 inches in diameter of the body of the tool. So it goes up and down, and it's covered with a lubricate grease. The grease forms that seal with the leather, and so as you put air tool oil in it, that will dilute the grease, and eventually it will start leaking. So if you have a pneumatic squeezer that you have been oiling, I would say quit oiling it, and if it stops producing pressure, if it stops working, oil it again because you already have it in there. There's nothing to lose. And if it doesn't redevelop that pressure, then you're going to have to send it back and have it re-lubricated inside. I don't recommend taking pneumatic squeezers apart because there's a lot of little needle bearings in there. It creates a giant puzzle if you don't know how to put it back together right. So pneumatic squeezer is the only thing that you don't use air tool oil on because it is greased inside. Okay, the next thing is Boelube. I wanted to mention, and this isn't really a maintenance thing other than it keeps your drill bits sharper longer. And not only drill bits, but anything that has a cutting edge on it. So files, bandsaw blades, hacksaw blades, sawzall blades, if you're using it for something else. There's two different kinds that we sell. One is like a candle, kind of. It's kind of a hard wax with the lubricant built into it. Both of these were developed by Boeing. What I don't like about this is it melts when you heat it up, so you put a hot drill bit in it and it melts to the drill bit, which is great. It works great on a saw blade because you can just run along the saw blade and it puts a little bit of this paraffin-like dust on each tooth of the blade. Same with files. What I prefer for drilling is what they call the paste. I have a small can of it here that we just use in our shop. And what the paste does is the paste is kind of a semi-liquid, like you would infer from a paste, right? So it sticks really well to whatever you stick in there. So I like that for drilling, reaming, things like that. And what I like most about this is that it stays that paste consistency, where the stick will go back to being hard, and then so if you don't wipe it up right away, if you're drilling aluminum and it gets on the aluminum, it creates that hard, waxy consistency again, where this always just wipes up with a paper towel and is easier to clean up with wax and grease remover when you go to paint, things like that. So that will probably 10 times, I would say, if you use that consistently, 10 times the life of any cutting tool. It works really, really well. The next thing is Scotch Brite wheels. We get a lot of questions on how to dress the Scotch Brite wheel. So I have my buffer here. Any Scotch Brite wheel is going to be the same. Let's see, probably this kind of view is going to work the best. As anybody that's been working with these wheels knows, that get grooves in the wheel, which are kind of handy to use sometimes, and then sometimes they just get to be a pain. So what you do to dress the wheel is people have heard, read online, whatever, to use a file, an old file, and just do that and grind the wheel down. Not very effective at doing that. Some people will try and use the wheel dressers that you find at some stores. Again, not very effective. I have here some 36 grit sandpaper in both a round and, I don't know what you call this, a bar sander form. The only reason I brought both of these is because they're both sticky back, so it's just pretty handy to have the sticky back ones. Normally I would clamp this to something else and let it stick, but in the interest of time. So what I do here is I will take, and I'll put the sandpaper on a board so that it is about like this, and I use the board as a lever. So it's touching back here, and then I'm bringing it up to touch it on the wheel. And this ensures that the wheel edge is going to be square, and it allows me to, if it's stuck, it allows me to go back and forth really easy and work that down. I'm not going to do this as a live demonstration. First of all, the wheels are expensive and there's nothing wrong with this wheel. And second, it is very, very messy. You definitely don't want to have your tie on when you come home from work and decide to dress your Scotch Brite wheel. It is terribly messy. And like I said, the Scotch Brite wheels are very expensive, so you want to avoid that as much as possible. Okay, and then I'm going to show a couple of countersink cages and countersink bit in case somebody's not building yet and is not familiar with this. So this is a standard microstop countersink bit. It has a pilot on it. This one is a single flute cutter with a hole in the middle of it, which are actually being discontinued. It's not the best thing to show, but and then it has a 1/4-28 thread, which almost all the countersink cutters have now. What I wanted to show is how I like to recommend people set their countersinks up. You can get by in your building with one countersink. However, you spend a lot of time switching back and forth between different cutters. And every time you change a cutter, then you have to readjust it. And so it takes quite a lot of time. So I recommend at least two. One that you always keep the 3/32 or the number 40 pilot in. And this one's marked 4263. And then I have a little line on it here. And what the line is for is this is customized to your cutter, cutter bit and your microstop both. We can't sell one that's pre-marked because they're all different. But once you get your cutter in, you can mark it so that I have this arrow lining up with this arrow here, and I have a little note on here that says dimpled. So when those two are lined up, that's the correct depth for dimpling. I'm sorry, for a substructure piece that a dimpled skin would go down into. And then I can just move it over here to this arrow. Have to make sure they're straight in to this arrow, and that says CS on it. So that's for a countersunk rivet. And so if I'm doing, say, a horizontal stabilizer skin, vertical stabilizer skin that the rivets are countersunk in or flush, I can set it this way. And if I'm doing a substructure piece that has a dimpled skin on top, I can set it that way. I don't have to go back and forth with a scrap piece trying to figure it out every time. So this will hold true until I take this cutter out. Once I loosen the cutter, it's check. What do they call it? Check and test. Guess and check. That's what it is. Guess and check. So then I have a second one here. This one's mine out of our box. So I have marked it 4264. Again, I have a line on it for dimple and a line on it for countersunk. And so this one's good until I change the cutter. Going back to what I originally said, I recommend you have at least two, one to leave set up for the number 40 pilot, and then one that you can switch back and forth with everything else. If you have the means to and enjoy having tools set up and not having to fuss with them, 3 is really nice because almost always the third one is number 6 or number 8 screw size, so you can leave these two set up and then just have the other one. So that saves a ton of time in swapping back and forth countersink cutters. And then also, along with the countersinks, I'm going to talk about two other things: the rivet removal tool and the angle drill and bits. And the reason that I'm going to talk about these is they all have a 1/4-28 thread that that they use to hold their tooling in. Okay, so the reason that's important is if I have, this is the rivet removal tool, it has a drill bit in there, and then it has a collar on the end of it that goes over a universal head rivet. So if I have a universal head rivet and I'm drilling the rivets out, works much like a countersink cutter, except it's not depth adjustable. Let me get rid of some of this so that maybe it shows up better. Okay, so if I'm drilling rivets out and I get to a space restriction, let's say I can't get this in there, what do I do? I'm stuck again. So then you just not use the rivet removal tool. Well, that's an option. You can do it by hand. A lot of times that's difficult to do. Or you can just take the end piece off and you can put your angle drill. This can be an angle drill adapter. It's just, again, what's in my toolbox, so I grabbed it. And you can hold this with your how do I hold it so you can see it? You can hold it with your fingers and then just manually feed in the angle drill. I could use the longer drill bit out of the rivet removal tool if I had space and I needed to. So that's one way that you can use the tools you already have to get in areas you don't think you can get into. Another way would be to use a countersink cutter in your angle drill if you have a tight spot for some odd reason that you need to get into. We also occasionally, the foot of the countersink is way too big, so you can't get up. I needed to have some examples ready. You can't get up next to something because something else is in the way. Well, how do you hold the countersink cutter? I happen to have a quick change adapter here that's made for threaded drill bits, but you could use it with the countersink cutter in your drill. If you pop this pin out of the countersink here, you can take the shaft out of it, just keep track of the way the parts go back together, but it's one pin you can pop out, and you end up with this shaft right here. So then you can put your countersink cutter in there, and you can, they call these suicides at this point because the professional mechanics do, probably because if you overdo it, you just wrecked a part. So, but that's a way that you can get down in a really tight area by manually countersinking. For some odd reason, again, if you needed to, you could put drill bits in. You could put drill bits in your countersink. They're all the same thing. One thing that's not often thought about, if you don't have some of these tools, if you don't want to take your countersink apart, cut off disc mandrel here also will hold the countersink. So maybe it's a deburring operation that you're just sick of doing it the way you've been doing it, or have to have a tight space restriction. So it's kind of neat that it all works together. And again, we'll get calls that people will call and say, well, I have this spot here and this is in the way, and so I'll start interrogating them. Do you have this tool? Do you have that tool? Put this together and that together, and you already have what you need to do the job, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So let me rearrange some stuff here, put some stuff back, and so I have another video on YouTube, I believe. If it's not on YouTube, it's all the videos done. I just haven't put it together to get on YouTube, of the tight fit dimpling fixture. So what this is it goes on the edge of a table, and it allows you to get into very tight spaces where your squeezer won't go. So this hangs over the edge of a table like so. You put your part on here, and then you need to hold your male die in something to hit it. So generally we use the post that comes out of the bottom of the C-frame, which is this piece right here. You can also, this is the piece that goes inside of a pneumatic squeezer. If you have one of those, you can put that on there, wrap it with a hammer. Obviously, if some people have the DRDT tool, and so they don't have this piece. So then they can, anything with a 3/16 hole works. So there's another example of how you can use what you already have to do an operation that you need to do. Also, bucking bars, we get a lot of calls, lots and lots of calls from people going, well, do you have anything that'll get into this little tiny space? There is a lot of times that you just have to figure it out, have to make your own. I have this bar that's been in our toolbox for 30 years. It's been there so long I have to look and see how it was made. So it's just a chunk of steel here with a strap of steel welded on each end. This one is about 3/16 of an inch thick. This one's about 1/4 of an inch thick. Here we just have a hole drilled through it, and it looks like it was countersunk with a number 10 for a 3/16 bolt, 3/16 countersunk screw. So what would you do with this? Well, if you have a spot that you need to get to get in, this is a terrible example because it's in the middle of the bar, but you can just drill a hole, countersink it, and then use your male die. In this case, this is before we started the tool business, and this is probably the what is it? The end rib for where you bolt the counterbalance on with a number 10 screw. So rather than, you have 2 screws in the airplane, right? So rather than buying a set of dies to do those 2 screws, you can use your countersink a number 10 hole in a bar, put the rib on top of there. Yeah, you can see that's not going to fit. And put the screw in the hole and tap it. It's not seen anyway in that location, so it's a great way to save some money as well. You can see here there's one for number 30 and one for number 3 or number 40, and a number 4 or a number 30. And so that was a place that, just like this, needed to get into a tight spot. And so you just made an ear on the end of there, reached in, and then you can use your other tool in your rivet gun or with a hammer and tap on the end of it to get that last dimple done. So if you can't weld, most of the time all that's important is the mass. So let's say you were trying to get in a place to rivet it. You could tape like crazy with electrical tape around there, and that's, you know, if you're pushing on it this way with the rivet, that's good enough. You're going to have enough mass behind it to do that. So there's a lot of places you just have to improvise to get in there and get those areas that are unconventional, that you would only, you don't need a tool, you don't want to develop a tool to only do it once. Okay, so the next thing, this comes from you, Bill. I don't know if you remember, I was out visiting you and we were playing around in your basement, and I hooked some hoses up, and you thought, I never would have thought of that. So this is our Deluxe Air Hose Kit, where the big heavy rubber hose from your compressor goes on here. This mounts to the bottom of the table, and it gives you ports for 3 air hoses. So the beauty of this is you can have 3 plugged in at the same time, so you can have your squeezer plugged in, and as you're going along squeezing rivets, if one rivet won't go through there, like often happens, you can pick up your drill with a reamer in it and just zip through that hole to clean it out, drop your rivet in, and keep going without having to plug and unplug all your tools. The reason I did 3 is I like to have a riveting tool, a drilling tool, and a blowgun all plugged in at the same time. So that's a little manifold, bolt screws to the bottom of your bench, so it keeps everything tight and contained. And since it's tight and contained, we have these hoses in 10-foot lengths is all. So you have a 10-foot length of hose so that it doesn't get to be too much under your feet. But oftentimes you you'll have your part just a little bit further away from the manifold. Of course, you want to mount this in the center of your bench. But if it's a little too far away, you can have your original hose plugged in there and then unplug one of your others and plug it in here. And so you can daisy chain all 3 of them together, and now you have a 30-foot hose from your manifold rather than 3 10-foots. And so just wanted to point that out, that it's just another way of configuring what you already have.
And that just speaks to my level of problem-solving skills right there.
Well, when you're so involved in how do I do this, how do I do that, you know, this is stuff that you don't want to have to think about. But after doing it for so long, it you know, becomes second nature, I guess. Okay, so 2 more things. Actually, one more thing that I wanted to show was a procedure that Wally Anderson out in Eugene that builds the SLSAs for RV-12s. This is a procedure that he's touted quite a bit. But sometimes you'll have a rivet, like in this area here, that's very difficult to get to with a squeezer. Thin nose yoke's even too too thick to get into here. But by improvising a little bit, you can put your rivet through the hole here, lay it up against your back rivet plate, and then put a small piece of steel on the top side of the rivet. This is a little bit too thick. I just went out in the back and grabbed something, but it needs to be as thick as this rather than a 1/4 inch or whatever it is, 5/16. So this would sit on the back side of the rivet, and then you would just, with your rivet gun, come in behind here and set the rivet this way. And so it is back riveting. You're back riveting it up against the plate, but you can't get anything else in there to back rivet it. So another way that you can this piece happens to be our tight fit dimpling fixture. You could use that if you want, but any little scrap of steel that you have will work fine. So indirect back riveting technique, that works pretty handy for some tight spots. So that's all I have. I breezed right through that. Does anybody have any questions yet? Bill, have you seen?